A 16-year-old girl who lived in the same house with her parents and younger sister went to sleep in her room, and in the morning she was found dead. The police immediately knew they were dealing with a murder, but none of her relatives heard anything that night. It took 31 years to finally solve this case, but no one was prepared for such a turn of events. Fawn Cox was born on March 24, 1973 in Kansas City, Missouri. Soon her parents had 2 more daughters. The family lived in a small 2-story house located in a poor residential area. From early childhood, she helped her parents care for their younger children, attended church regularly, and enjoyed swimming. When she turned 16, Fawn got a part-time job at a local amusement park. Her family lived quite poorly, and the girl tried to earn at least some money in her free time from studying. She spent most of the summer holidays in 1989 at work. Basically, the girl stood behind the cash register, selling tickets for attractions. On Wednesday, July 26, she finished her shift at approximately 10 p.m. Her mother and younger sister picked her up by car, since it would have taken a very long time to get from the park to home by public transport. Almost immediately after returning home, Fawn went to bed, since the next morning she had to go to work again. The girl slept on the 2nd floor. She had a separate room. Her sisters usually slept in the room next door, but that night she was alone on the floor. Her sister Amber, who was just a year younger, was working as a nanny for a family friend that night. Another sister, Felicia, decided to sleep on the 1st floor because it was much cooler there. It was a very hot night, and the only working air conditioner was downstairs. Their parents also slept on the 1st floor. The next morning at about 9 o'clock, the whole family woke up to the sound of the alarm clock in Fawn's room, but for some reason the girl did not turn it off. Then her younger sister and mother went up to her room, where a terrible sight awaited them. The Fawn lay on the bed without signs of life. Bruises were visible on her neck. The girl also had no pulse, and her parents immediately called an ambulance, but they were no longer able to help her. It was clear that Fawn had died several hours ago. After examining the body, medical experts determined that the cause of death was strangulation. The girl was also subjected to violence. From the very first hours, the police realized that they had a very difficult investigation ahead of them. Despite the fact that Fawn was killed right in her room, in a small house with very poor sound insulation, her parents and sister heard absolutely nothing. However, there was an explanation for this. The air conditioner on the 1st floor was old and very loud, drowning out any other noise in the house. The only strange thing that Sister Fawn noticed that night was that their poodle was acting anxious and barking. But this was not given much importance. This behavior was attributed to the fact that the dog was pregnant. By investigating the crime instead, the police made several important discoveries. According to them, the attacker or a group of criminals entered the house through a 2nd floor window overlooking the backyard. An old trailer was parked near the house, from which one could easily climb onto the canopy of the extension, located almost at the same level as the window. The window itself was left open, since there was no air conditioning on the 2nd floor, and we had to somehow deal with the heat. In the Fawn room, experts discovered the first important clues. A few short hairs, small blood stains, and traces of semen on the sheets of her bed. All this was sent to the laboratory for analysis. In addition, several items were missing from the house, including radios, a games console, and a stereo tape recorder. Several other items were found on the ground in front of the house. It looked like the burglar had thrown them out the window to take them with him, but for some reason left them there. Detectives also discovered that various items had been removed from the closets of an adjacent room on the 2nd floor. In their opinion, the criminal was hiding in that closet, waiting for all the residents of the house to fall asleep. Usually the Fawn sisters slept in this room, but not that night. For this reason, no one noticed the items on display. The police managed to discover another strange piece of evidence. In Fawn's room they found an old army cap. All of her relatives said that they had never seen this item on the girl, so detectives admitted that the killer could have forgotten the cap at the crime scene. Despite the impressive array of evidence, the police were unable to quickly identify the suspects. The problem is that in 1989, DNA testing was quite poorly developed, and there were no common genetic databases then. Detective Benjamin Caldwell, who worked on the case, put forward the main version of what happened. In his opinion, there really could have been several attackers, and they must have known this house well. Not only did they know how to get to the second floor through the backyard in pitch darkness, but they also had to know the location of the rooms. The next step for the police was to search for witnesses. They interviewed Fawn's neighbors, friends and relatives, but all this did not bring any results. The detectives had one significant problem. The area in which this house was located was very poor and criminal. Various criminal groups operated in it, and it was quite difficult to bring their participants to justice. A month after the murder of Fawn, the case finally moved forward. The police had a witness who pointed them to 3 suspects. This witness knew a number of important details that the police never made public, so his story was taken seriously. These suspects turned out to be 3 teenagers, one of whom was in the same class with Fawn. They were arrested and interrogated, but the boys denied any involvement in the murder. During a search in the house of one of them, police found items stolen from the victim's room. This was enough to charge all 3 with murder. But even here, the detectives were disappointed. First, the witness suddenly retracted his statement and stopped cooperating with the police. Secondly, DNA analysis of hair, blood and semen found at the crime scene did not show a clear match with the samples of the suspects. In those years, experts were still unable to establish an exact match between the samples, and all tests showed controversial results. In other words, the analysis could not confirm either a complete match or a guaranteed mismatch. Despite this, the police managed to obtain useful information from one of the detainees. During one of the interrogations, he admitted that that night he actually broke into Fawn's house in company with other guys and stole several things. He described how he cleaned up the second floor and even revealed unknown details. According to him, when he threw the tape recorder out of the window, its handle fell off. The guy hid it under a bush nearby, and the police actually found this item in that very place. But the young man quickly retracted his words and no longer cooperated with the investigation, which is why his confession could not be used in court. In view of all this, the police had to release these people, and the investigation again reached a dead end. Most likely, the witnesses were simply intimidated, but without their testimony in court, the case had practically no chance. Is it known that one of them spent 8 months in prison for stealing items from Fawn's house? Since then, the matter has gone on the back burner. The police only reopened the investigation in the early 2000s, and the first thing they did was upload DNA samples from the crime scene into the CODIS database. It had been created several years earlier and contained DNA samples from people convicted of serious crimes. Unfortunately, no matches to Fawn's killer were found. The emergence of this database was the result of serious scientific progress in the field of DNA research. It also allowed police to recollect DNA samples from the 3 original suspects and conduct more advanced tests. This time, experts unequivocally determined that the hair, semen and blood did not belong to any of them. This was very strange considering the fact that Favom's belongings were found on the suspects. Detectives theorized that 3 guys were actually burglarizing her house that night, but there was another person with them. It was he who raped the girl and killed her. All this raised even more questions. Did 4 criminals immediately quietly enter the house, kill Favom, and just as quietly leave the crime scene? The police still did not have an answer to this question. Since then, the case has stalled again. Every year, the Favom family believed less and less that this murder would ever be solved. They continued to believe that the 3 suspects were in their house that night and could point to the killer, but they never did. The only thing that can help them find out the truth is a DNA sample kept in the police laboratory. Something interesting happened in 2018. Amber, Phom's younger sister, provided some disturbing details about the crime. She presented her thoughts and facts unknown to the police on a popular American forum dedicated to unsolved crimes. Over the 23 years of its existence, the forum has acquired a very reliable reputation, and its members have helped the police solve several high-profile cases. Amber has been verified and confirmed that she is who she says she is, so her message deserves attention. In her opinion, the criminals entered the house at the moment when Phom's mother and her youngest daughter went to pick her up from her place of work. Their father, who was at home at that moment, was sleeping. Next, the criminals hid in a closet in an empty room on the second floor and waited until everyone fell asleep. Amber also said that at least 2 of the criminals were personally acquainted with Phom. One of them studied with her, but the second met the girl in church a few days before the murder. Amber was present at the time of their meeting, and she was sure that the guy was interested in her sister romantically. She further concluded that the criminals had originally planned to kill Phom, and the robbery was only a contributing factor. The police adhered to the version that the criminals entered the house for the purpose of making money, and saw a sleeping girl there, after which they decided to subject her to violence. But why was Amber so sure that they were preparing in advance for the murder? She said that robbing their house was simply pointless. The family lived poorly and they had nothing of value. But much more interesting was the following fact. Amber said that to strangle Phom, the criminals used her younger sister's nightie, which was lying in the next room. This meant that the attackers had taken her with them from that room in advance, and were hiding in the closet to strangle the victim. If they had not planned the murder in advance and had stumbled upon Phom during the robbery, there would have been no point in taking the nightie from the next room. Amber added that the perpetrators also had to know their family's routine in order to sneak into the house undetected. She herself worked as a nanny from Monday to Friday and was at home only during the daytime. Over the weekend, the girls spent the night in the same room on the second floor through which the robbers made their way. Accordingly, the criminals would have been immediately noticed. In addition, they had to watch the house and wait for the moment when Phom's mother and her younger sister went to pick up the girl from work. Despite all this, Amber's story did not bring any closer to the solution to this case. But it was already 2018, and the science in the field of studying DNA has stepped far forward. Dozens of long-forgotten cases have been solved thanks to new analysis tools. Phom's relatives saw all this and were indignant at why the police were in no hurry to resume the murder investigation. They constantly communicated with detectives on this case and received the same answer each time. Advanced studies of DNA samples demand money, and there are dozens of such cases from the police. For this reason, relatives could only wait for their turn to come and funding to arrive. But they decided to take the initiative into their own hands, and in 2019 they launched a fundraiser. The family wanted to cover the full cost of studying the DNA samples, and also offered a reward of $10,000 for any information leading to the capture of the criminal. Due to the fact that this case was actively covered in the media and relatives gave numerous interviews, many concerned people responded to requests for help. The family quickly collected the required amount, but even here they were disappointed. The police department refused to initiate this investigation at the expense of the victim's relatives. The lead detective explained this by saying that in such a situation a big problem was bound to arise. If the relatives of one victim can pay for such tests and speed up the results, then hundreds of other families who spend years searching for those responsible for the murder of their loved ones should have the same right. It is simply impossible to implement this in practice, since innovative DNA research is carried out by only a few laboratories in the world, and with such a simultaneous influx of interested people, there simply won't be enough resources. The girls' relatives believed that the police were in no hurry to deal with their case for another reason. They were from a poor family in a bad area, and murders there were not a priority for investigators. In an interview, Sister Phom said that if we were talking about the murder of family members of rich or high-ranking people, all the necessary research would be carried out instantly. Unfortunately, they were never able to speed up this process, and only towards the end of 2020 did the long-awaited breakthrough happen. But the family was not ready for such a truth. With financial support from the FBI, police eventually sent samples from Fawn's room to the laboratory. We started there to a detailed study of DNA and the search for possible relatives of its owners. They mainly worked with the semen sample found at the murder scene. In November 2020, they finally managed to find a person who owned this DNA, who turned out to be Fawn's cousin, Donald Hawks. Of course, such news shocked the whole family. At the time of Fawn's death, Donald was 21 years old, and no one even thought about his possible involvement. At the same time, Donald was a rather problematic person and constantly ended up in jail. He was convicted of misdemeanor offenses such as theft and possession of controlled substances. Unfortunately, in those years, DNA samples had not yet been taken from such criminals. Otherwise, this case would have been solved much earlier. In 2006, Donald died of an overdose, but police investigated his death because some circumstances seemed suspicious to them. It was thanks to this investigation that a sample of his DNA was saved, but it was not included in the FBI database, since the man in that case was a victim, not a criminal. Once the experts informed the police of their discovery, they compared the sample with the semen found at the murder scene and obtained a 100% match. Despite the severity of this discovery, Fawn's relatives received an answer to a question that had tormented them for 31 years. But in this whole story there is one very important point. Plenty of evidence indicates that the three original suspects were also at Fawn's house that night. Now it became clear how the criminals knew the house and family routine so accurately. Donald was a frequent guest and knew all these nuances. However, the police closed the case, and no new charges were brought against the three men. Sister Fawn stated that she saw no point in extorting a confession from them, even though these people were present in the house that night. They may not have even witnessed the murder itself. Donald could well have remained alone in the house and only then attacked Fawn. The sister added that the three suspects had already paid for their actions. During all this time, when the case remained unsolved, the entire area was 100% sure of their guilt. Because of this, there was an extremely negative attitude towards them, with all the ensuing consequences. According to Sister Fawn, their lives were virtually broken. In addition, after the case was closed, it turned out that the police initially learned about these suspects from the family of one of them. Relatives noticed a console among his things and remembered that it was exactly the same one that was stolen from Fawn's house. This was mentioned in the news, and every resident of the area already knew all the details. In any case, it was simply impossible to prove their guilt, and the victim's relatives finally know the name of the killer. He lived for 17 years without suffering any punishment for what he had done, and all this time, as if nothing had happened, he communicated with his family. But ultimately, his addiction to illegal substances drove him to the grave, and he no longer posed a threat to anyone.